The morning sun barely crested the horizon when I stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, expecting the familiar sight of my sunflower field, a golden expanse of towering giants swaying gently in the crisp breeze. Instead, I was met with a scene that looked like a massacre. Stalks lay snapped and broken, petals trampled into the dirt, and the once majestic blooms were gone, ripped clean from their roots. My heart thudded in my chest, disbelief quickly giving way to a boiling rage as I gripped my mug so tightly it nearly shattered. It was as if someone had taken a torch to a priceless painting and walked away whistling. Then, amid the carnage, a fluttering piece of paper caught my eye, stuck to a splintered stalk with a wad of pink chewing gum. I yanked it free and read the aggressively cursive scrawl. "Borrowed for the HOA gala. Thanks for your contribution to the community. Karen." For a full 10 seconds, my brain stalled, unable to process the audacity. Borrowed. These weren't library books. They were my prized sunflowers, the result of years of careful cultivation, hybridization, and perfection. And they had the gall to call it a contribution, as if I'd cheerfully handed them over to fuel their suburban tyranny. The coffee wasn't enough to steady my nerves anymore. My fists clenched as I stormed back toward the house, mind racing with the absurdity of it all. Karen and her crew hadn't even tried to be discreet. I had them on camera. Pulling up the security footage on my phone, I hit play and watched the botanical heist unfold. There they were. Karen, Linda, Barbara, and Diane, decked out in overpriced Lululemon leggings, wielding garden shears like a squad of flower assassins. They giggled like schoolgirls as they hacked away at my yard, stuffing sunflowers into the trunk of Karen's SUV as if they were looting a florist's vault. Diane even paused to snap a selfie with my largest sunflower, holding it like a trophy fish before yanking it from the soil. A bitter laugh escaped me. This wasn't over. If Karen and her hedge trimmer posse thought I'd let this slide, they were sorely mistaken. But before I confronted them, I needed to rein in my fury, because dealing with Karen was like wrestling a raccoon over a trash can, messy, loud, and liable to leave you scratched up. I stomped toward the HOA office, blood simmering with every step, determined to face the queen of this floral felony herself. The moment I stepped into the HOA office, I spotted her, Karen Whitmore, perched behind the desk like she ruled suburbia, sipping a venti pumpkin spice latte as if she hadn't just orchestrated an act of garden terrorism. She barely glanced up as I approached, her manicured fingers tapping lazily at her laptop. "Mark," she cooed, flashing a snake-hole smile, "I was just about to call you. The sunflowers look stunning at the gala venue. They really liven up the space." I took a slow breath, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Karen, I didn't donate my sunflowers. You and your friends trespassed on my property and stole them." Her fake smile didn't budge. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It was just a few flowers. We assumed you'd be happy to support the community event." My restraint snapped. "A few flowers? You stripped my entire garden like locusts. What part of breaking into my yard and stealing thousands of dollars worth of plants seemed like a logical assumption to you?" She chuckled dismissively, waving a hand. "Mark, don't be ridiculous. It's not like you were selling them. They were just sitting there. Besides, it's for the greater good. Everyone gets to enjoy them now, not just you." My eye twitched as I leaned in, voice low. "That's like saying you took someone's car because it was parked in their driveway and not being driven. You're going to regret this, Karen." Karen sighed, setting her latte down with an exaggerated air of patience, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum over a lost toy. "Fine, Mark. If you're really that upset, I can maybe get you a free drink at the gala or something." I almost laughed, almost. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the security footage, and hit play. Her eyes flicked to the screen, and I watched her face cycle through a hilarious parade of emotions. Confusion, annoyance, fake indignation, a fleeting attempt at bargaining, and finally the dawning realization that she was caught red-handed. "This is trespassing, theft, and destruction of property," I said calmly, letting the weight of the words sink in. "And since you think my sunflowers were just flowers, let me enlighten you. These were specially cultivated hybrids, and I had them insured." Karen blinked, her composure faltering. "Insured?" she repeated as if the concept were foreign. "Yes, insured," I replied, savoring the moment. "Which means this isn't just a petty neighborhood spat. It's theft of high-value botanical property, and you're going to pay for it." For the first time, her confident mask cracked, but she quickly rallied. "Mark, let's not escalate this into something bigger than it needs to be. It's not like I ripped up your entire yard." I smiled, a slow, deliberate grin. "Oh, but you did. And I've got an invoice coming your way, a very large invoice. Karen scoffed, crossing her arms. An invoice? You can't seriously think I'm going to pay you for a few flowers. I leaned in closer, voice steady as steel. Not just a few flowers. You stole an entire season's worth of work, ruined months of cultivation, and you have no idea how much those plants were actually worth. Her face paled slightly, the first real sign of doubt creeping in. How much? She asked, her tone less certain. I took my time, letting the suspense build. $500,000. Karen choked on her latte, spluttering as if I'd just told her the moon was for sale. That's absurd. There's no way flowers cost that much. I shrugged, scrolling casually through my phone. Tell that to the insurance company, the legal team reviewing this, and the viral video I'm about to post. If you don't want to pay, I can take it to small claims court. But given the HOA's financial situation, I doubt the board will be thrilled to bankroll your little flower heist. Her mouth opened and closed like a stranded fish, words failing her. I turned and headed for the door, pausing just before stepping out. Oh, and Karen, next time you want flowers for an event, try a florist. They prefer customers who pay instead of loot. As I left, I could hear the frantic clicking of her keyboard. She could email, complain, and spin this all she wanted, but the reality was clear. She'd picked the wrong guy to mess with. The invoice was sent that afternoon, the legal wheels were turning, and all I had to do now was wait. But I didn't have to wait long. Less than 24 hours later, my phone rang, Karen's name flashing on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, smirking as her indignant voice filled the speaker. Mark, this is absolutely ridiculous. $500,000 for some flowers. You cannot be serious. You're being completely unreasonable, and I will not be bullied into paying for something that was for the community's benefit. Call me back immediately so we can talk like adults. I didn't call her back. There was nothing to discuss. Instead, I forwarded the invoice and footage to my cousin Gina, a lawyer who lived for HOA disputes and had been itching for a case like this. When I told her the story, she laughed gleefully. "Oh, this is going to be fun," she said, and I knew Karen was in for a reckoning. By noon, the HOA board was in chaos. Word of the invoice and Karen's sunflower heist spread like wildfire through Maplewood, and homeowners were livid. My phone buzzed with texts from neighbors I barely knew, all demanding to know how Karen had gotten away with this. Apparently, the HOA's funds were already strained after last year's fiasco. A half-baked attempt to install a neighborhood security gate no one wanted. So the idea of coughing up $500,000 for Karen's ego trip didn't sit well with anyone. She, ever the manipulator, tried to spin the narrative in her favor. An email blasted out to the community, titled "A Misunderstanding Regarding the HOA Gala Decorations," where she painted herself as a martyr. She claimed she'd only taken the flowers because she assumed I'd want to contribute to the neighborhood's beautification, and that I was now extorting her with an outrageous sum out of spite. It was a masterclass in delusion, until it backfired. Someone, likely a fed-up ally from her own circle, leaked the security footage to the Maplewood Facebook group. Within hours, the video of Karen and her yoga pants posse stripping my garden bare was everywhere, racking up comments like, "So she just helped herself to his property and called it a donation. That's theft. And did anyone else see Diane taking a selfie while committing a crime? Classy." The community's outrage grew, and Karen's grip on the narrative slipped through her fingers like sand. Desperate, she made her next misstep. The following morning, I received an HOA notice claiming my front yard, now a barren mess thanks to her, was in violation of community guidelines, labeled excessively overgrown and an eyesore requiring immediate correction or fines. I stared at the paper, incredulous, before bursting into laughter. She was actually trying to punish me for exposing her, a transparent, pathetic retaliation. I scanned the notice and sent it to Gina, who fired back a response within hours. Her letter pointed out the obvious. My garden had been pristine until Karen destroyed it, and any further harassment would give me grounds to countersue. The HOA backed off fast, but Karen wasn't done escalating. She started a smear campaign, telling anyone who'd listen that I was a disruptive neighbor with a vendetta against the HOA. She even claimed my sunflowers might have violated landscaping rules all along, hinting they were unauthorized plant species. It was a desperate Hail Mary, and it crashed spectacularly. The community, already fuming over misused HOA funds, wasn't buying her sob story, especially not with the footage proving her guilt. Then the local news caught wind of it. A reporter from the town's biggest station showed up at my doorstep, eager to cover the sunflower scandal rocking Maplewood. I handed over the footage, explained the situation, and let the evidence do the talking. That night, the segment aired, juxtaposing shots of my sunflowers in their former glory with the grainy clip of Karen and her crew stuffing them into garbage bags like petty thieves. The cherry on top, an HOA board member, realizing the legal mess Karen had dragged them into, went on air saying, "The board does not condone the actions of our HOA president, and we are currently reviewing the matter." Translation: Karen was toast. The next morning, I saw her packing outside her house, phone in hand, as a moving truck idled in her driveway. Rumors swirled that the board had pressured her to resign, and the legal battle had torched her reputation so badly she was selling her house to flee the neighborhood. It was almost too perfect. Karen Whitmore, self-appointed suburban dictator, brought low by her own greed and a field of stolen sunflowers. The fallout from Karen's sunflower heist was swift and satisfying. Later that afternoon, an email from the HOA board landed in my inbox, confirming what the rumors had hinted at. Karen had been officially ousted as president. The message was curt, promising a review of community policies to prevent future incidents. But the real kicker came a few hours later when her lawyer reached out. Karen was offering a settlement, a hefty sum, though nowhere near the $500,000 I demanded, to avoid dragging this mess further through the courts. I stared at the number, tempted to push for more just to watch her squirm, but after 3 seconds of deliberation, I typed back, "I accept." It wasn't just about the money. I'd won in every way that mattered. The woman who'd lorded over Maplewood like a petty tyrant was dethroned, her reputation in tatters, and the neighborhood knew exactly what she was. With the settlement secured, I started planning my next move. Part of the cash would go toward rebuilding my garden bigger, better, a middle finger to Karen's memory, and the rest would fund projects I'd shelved for years. The check cleared 2 days later, and as I watched my bank balance swell, a quiet satisfaction settled in my chest. Karen's absence changed Maplewood overnight. Without her looming presence, the air felt lighter, almost celebratory. Neighbors who'd once kept their heads down started speaking up, questioning HOA rules that had gone unchallenged for too long. People tossed around ideas for new leadership, someone who'd actually care about the community, not just their own power trip. It was as if her downfall had snapped everyone out of a trance. Then came the icing on the cake. The HOA board announced that, due to recent financial adjustments and overwhelming backlash, annual fees would drop for the first time in over a decade. It was a small win, but a sweet one. Karen had spent years nickel-and-diming us, justifying every fee hike with vague promises of improvements that never came. Meanwhile, she'd been blowing funds on things like that doomed security gate. Now, with her gone, people were finally seeing where their money had really been going. The neighborhood buzzed with a newfound energy, and I couldn't help but feel a little proud that my sunflowers had sparked it all. I debated skipping the next HOA meeting. Why wade back into that mess? But curiosity won out. I wanted to see what a post-Karen Maplewood looked like up close. When I walked into the community center, the vibe was unrecognizable. The usual tension was gone, replaced by an eager hum. People actually seemed happy to be there. The meeting kicked off with a vote for a new president, and to everyone's amusement, Linda, Karen's former right-hand woman, had conveniently stepped down for personal reasons, leaving the spot wide open. Then, to my shock, someone nominated me. I laughed, shaking my head as chuckles rippled through the room. I'd never wanted anything to do with HOA politics, especially not after this, and I wasn't about to become the thing I'd just toppled. I declined, paving the way for Mrs. Henderson, a retired teacher who'd been pushing for reform for months. She won in a landslide, and for once people clapped instead of groaning through an election. Afterward, a few neighbors approached me, some to thank me, others to apologize for staying silent under Karen's reign. I waved it off. She'd ruled through fear, and I didn't blame them for dodging her wrath. That night, standing on my porch, I looked over the remnants of my garden, already picturing what it could become with the settlement money. A phoenix rising from Karen's ashes. With the settlement money in hand, I didn't waste time. The next week, I brought in professionals, landscapers, irrigation experts, even a local botanist, to transform my yard into something extraordinary. We ripped out the old layout, installed better irrigation, and carved out new flower beds designed to showcase sunflowers in staggered bloom cycles so there'd always be a splash of gold, no matter the season. I wasn't just rebuilding, I was upgrading, turning Karen's destruction into a statement. The botanist and I worked on a new hybrid strain, taller, tougher, with petals that practically glowed in the sun. Months later, when it finally bloomed, I named it Karen's Regret, a little jab that felt just right. Word of the new garden spread fast. Neighbors started stopping by to gawk, snapping photos of the towering blooms swaying in the breeze. Kids who'd never cared about plants before began asking questions. How long they took to grow, what made them so big, and soon my personal passion project morphed into a community draw. It was strange, seeing something born from anger become a source of joy for others, but it fit. My sunflowers weren't just mine anymore, they were Maplewood's. One afternoon, as I knelt in the dirt tending to some new sprouts, a car rolled up to the curb. I glanced up, expecting another curious neighbor, but my stomach flipped when I saw who stepped out, Karen. She looked different, stripped of her usual armor. No pressed slacks, no HOA badge, just casual clothes and an air of uncertainty that I'd never seen on her before. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stood, watching as she approached the garden fence and stopped, keeping a cautious distance. She said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I nodded, not offering anything more, letting her stew in the silence. She sighed, her eyes sweeping over the rows of sunflowers, bigger and bolder than the ones she'd stolen. They're beautiful, she admitted, almost reluctantly. Better than before, I shrugged. Had the resources to do it right this time. She nodded, chewing her lip, then finally met my gaze. Look, I just wanted to say that She paused, exhaling sharply. I know I messed up. I let things get out of control. I thought I was doing what was best for the neighborhood, but I see now that I was. I hurt people, I hurt you. I studied her, searching for the old Karen, the schemer, the manipulator, but she wasn't there. This was just a woman who'd lost her throne, her allies, her home, and was finally facing the wreckage she'd left behind. Yeah, I said simply. You did. She swallowed hard, nodding again. I wanted to apologize. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it. For a long moment, I said nothing, letting her words hang between us. Then I gave a short nod. Thanks. She hesitated, like she wanted to add more, but instead offered a small, sad smile. Take care of the garden, Mark. With that, she turned and walked back to her car, the engine humming to life as she drove off. I watched her disappear down the street, certain it was the last I'd ever see of her. When I turned back to the garden, a breeze rustled through the sunflowers, their heads bobbing as if in agreement. Karen was gone, for good this time, and my little patch of earth was thriving again. It wasn't just a victory over her. It was a reclaiming of something she'd tried to take, now stronger than ever. Karen's visit lingered in my mind longer than I expected, not because I doubted her sincerity, but because it marked the end of something, a chapter I hadn't realized I'd been stuck in until it closed. Standing there, watching the sunflowers sway, I felt a weight lift I hadn't known I was carrying. The garden wasn't just a comeback, it was a triumph, a living testament to resilience over petty tyranny. With her gone, Maplewood seemed to exhale too. The HOA, under Mrs. Henderson's steady hand, started undoing years of Karen's overreach. Meetings became less about fines and nitpicking, more about actual community needs, playground repairs, better street lighting, things people cared about. Neighbors who'd avoided my gaze during the feud now waved as they passed, some even stopping to chat about the flowers or share their own Karen horror stories. It was like the neighborhood had woken up from a bad dream, and I'd somehow become the guy who'd helped flip the switch. I didn't mind. I'd never set out to be a hero, but I wasn't mad about the free coffee offers that started coming my way. The garden kept growing, both in size and reputation. By midsummer, Karen's Regret was the star of the show, 8 feet tall, with blooms so vibrant they looked painted on. People drove from neighboring towns just to see it, snapping pictures and asking for seeds I didn't have to give. I'd catch kids peering over the fence, wide-eyed, and their parents would laugh when I handed out clippings from the smaller plants, telling them to try their luck. It hit me one evening, as I watched a family take selfies with the sunflowers, that this was bigger than me now. What Karen had meant to destroy had turned into something that brought people together, a quiet revenge I hadn't planned but loved all the same. The settlement money kept the project humming. I added a small bench near the fence, a nod to the visitors, and started sketching plans for a greenhouse out back. The botanist I'd worked with suggested entering Karen's regret in a regional competition, but I waved it off. Winning wasn't the point. Growing it was. Still, not everything was perfect. The HOA's reduced fees didn't erase the memory of Karen's reign, and some folks grumbled about the board's slow pace undoing her old rules. A few die-hard loyalists, Linda and Barbara mostly, tried stirring up trouble, whispering that I'd bullied Karen out of town with my overpriced flowers. It didn't stick. The footage and her own exit had sealed her fate too tightly for their gossip to gain traction. One night at a community barbecue I'd been roped into attending, Linda sidled up with a tight smile and said, "You must be proud, Mark, turning a little dirt into such a big deal." I grinned, popping a chip in my mouth. "Dirt's worth something when you know how to use it." She huffed and walked off, but the dig felt good, proof her crowd was irrelevant now. The barbecue itself was a sign of the shift, people mingling, laughing, no HOA clipboard in sight. Mrs. Henderson even gave a short speech, thanking me for shaking things up, which got a round of applause I didn't expect. I raised my drink in return, keeping it short. To sunflowers and second chances. The crowd cheered, and for the first time in years, Maplewood felt like a place I actually wanted to call home. As summer faded into fall, the garden hit its peak. The staggered bloom cycles I'd planned paid off. Waves of sunflowers kept the yard alive with color, even as the days shortened. Karen's regret stood tallest, its golden heads catching the late afternoon light like tiny suns. Neighbors still stopped by, though the crowds thinned as school started and routines took over. I didn't mind. The quiet let me focus on the next phase. With the greenhouse blueprints finalized, I broke ground out back, envisioning a space to experiment year-round. New hybrids, maybe some rare strains I'd read about in botany journals. The settlement money made it possible, but the drive came from something deeper. A need to keep pushing, to prove that what Karen broke could grow back stronger. Every shovel of dirt felt like a middle finger to her memory, and I caught myself smiling more than I expected. The work was hard, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. The neighborhood kept evolving too. Mrs. Henderson's leadership brought a calm competence Karen never had. She axed half the old landscaping rules, including the one about unauthorized plant species Karen had tried to pin on me, and replaced them with guidelines that actually made sense. People started planting their own gardens, inspired by mine or just tired of beige lawns. One guy down the street even put up a sign, "Sunflowers welcome here," with a little cartoon of Karen running away. It got a laugh out of me every time I passed it. The HOA meeting stayed civil, almost productive, and when someone suggested a community garden project, I volunteered some cuttings from my smaller plants. It wasn't about taking charge, just paying forward what the sunflowers had started. By October, the first sprouts popped up in the shared plot, and watching kids water them with oversized cans felt like a win I hadn't seen coming. Not everyone was thrilled with the changes, of course. Linda and Barbara kept their distance but didn't stop sniping. At the grocery store one day, I overheard Barbara muttering to a cashier about that ridiculous flower man and how I'd ruined a perfectly good HOA. The cashier just shrugged, and I let it slide. Her bitterness was her problem, not mine. The real test came when the regional botany club reached out again, this time with an award offer for Karen's regret. They'd heard about it through the grapevine and wanted to feature it in their newsletter. I thought it over, then said yes. Not for the recognition, but because it'd mean free publicity for the community garden. The write-up ran in November, complete with a photo of me grinning in front of the towering blooms, and the club sent a small plaque I hung in the greenhouse once it was finished. It read, "Innovation in Resilience," which felt oddly fitting. By winter, the garden settled into dormancy, but the greenhouse hummed with life. I'd started a few experimental trays, some crosses with Karen's regret, others just for fun, and spent evenings there with a beer, the quiet broken only by the hum of the heaters. One night, a neighbor kid knocked on the door, asking if he could see the setup for a school project. I let him in, showed him the seedlings, and sent him home with a spare pot to try himself. His grin as he left stuck with me, a reminder that this wasn't just about beating Karen anymore. It was about building something lasting, something she'd never understand. The sunflowers might have sparked the fight, but what grew from it was bigger than her, bigger than me, and it wasn't stopping anytime soon. Winter tightened its grip on Maplewood, blanketing the garden in frost, but the greenhouse glowed like a beacon against the gray. Inside, Karen's regret seedlings stretched toward the grow lights, their tiny leaves a promise of spring. I'd gotten hooked on the rhythm of it, tending trays, tweaking soil mixes, tracking growth rates in a battered notebook. The botanist I'd worked with dropped by sometimes, tossing around ideas for new hybrids, and we'd lose hours debating petal size or drought resistance. It wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was a craft, a quiet obsession that filled the space Karen's chaos had left behind. Outside, the community garden held its own, dormant but cared for, with plans for a spring expansion already in motion. Neighbors had taken to it more than I'd expected. Some even asked for tips, turning my porch into an unofficial advice booth. I didn't mind. Seeing their yards bloom come April would be worth it. The HOA stayed steady under Mrs. Henderson, who'd become a minor legend for dodging Karen's old tricks. She'd uncovered a stash of misspent funds. Petty cash Karen had funneled into consulting fees for her cronies and redirected it to fix the potholes on Elm Street. People noticed. Linda and Barbara tried one last gasp, petitioning to reinstate some of Karen's rules at a December meeting, but it flopped, 3 votes to 40. They slunk out after, and I heard later they'd put their houses up for sale. Good riddance. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. Grumbles about snow removal popped up, but it felt alive, less like a battleground and more like a place people wanted to be. My sunflowers had lit the fuse, but the shift was collective, a slow reclaiming of what Karen had smothered. I like to think she'd hate that most of all. One crisp morning, as I sipped coffee in the greenhouse, my phone buzzed with a text from Gina. "Saw this and thought of you." Attached was a real estate listing from a town 2 hours away, Karen's old house, relisted at a loss. I smirked, imagining her packing some new cul-de-sac, stripped of her HOA crown and probably still blaming me. The thought didn't sting anymore, it just amused me. Later that day, the Botany Club emailed. Karen's Regret had won a Reader's Choice Award after the newsletter, and they wanted to send a photographer in spring. I agreed, figuring it'd be a nice capstone. By then, the garden would be in full swing again, a riot of gold against the green, and I'd be ready with a new strain I dubbed Maplewood Rise, a nod to the neighborhood's comeback. The plaque from the first award hung above my workbench, catching the light as I watered the trays. That night, I stepped outside, breath fogging in the cold, and looked over the sleeping garden. The sunflowers were gone for now, but their roots held firm beneath the soil, waiting. I thought back to that morning, the shock of the wreckage, the note, the rage, and then to Karen's apology, her taillights fatting down the street. It felt like a lifetime ago. The settlement had rebuilt more than my yard. It had seeded something bigger, a legacy of sorts. I wasn't the guy who just wanted his flowers back anymore. I was the one who turned a theft into a triumph for me and Maplewood both. As I headed inside, the greenhouse light flickered through the dark, a steady pulse. Spring would come, the sunflowers would rise, and whatever Karen was up to, it wouldn't touch this. The thorns she'd stumbled over had grown into something she'd never outrun, and I was just getting started.